Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Trevor Johnson, Senior Research Expert at Ipsos. Trevor, you have the floor.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you all for joining us. Like Megan said, my name is Trevor Johnson. I am a senior researcher here at Ipsos, and I'll be presenting with Kat Heller, who is a senior designer with me on the Ipsos User Experience and Human Factors team. Our team practices a wide array of research and design principles in UX across several industries, everything from expert evaluation of early design to formative and research, design or early research, as well as summative user testing of products for FDA submission, all the way through post-market analysis of products, sites, and services that are actively being consumed on the market. And our team has worked across multiple industries on more than 4,500 user research projects, over 300 of which have been focused primarily on design. So my team has developed our expertise for best practices across identifying user expectations. And one thing that's true across all industries that have consumer-facing products is that the provider of the product or service needs to be able to meet the users for the task at hand. And today what we're going to focus on is building better pharmaceutical websites through user research and information architecture. So what that looks like is we're going to start by sharing with why there's a need for good usability. We'll follow up with considerations that need to be taken into account when designing pharmaceutical websites. We'll highlight common design issues that currently exist in the industry and how usability design can be applied and research can be implemented to make these problems not such a big deal. And we'll finish up by talking about the importance of information architecture. Before we get into all that, though, I do want to share a story from college with you all. In the summer of 2012, I was studying the Arabic language, and I studied abroad in Jordan for the summer. We went on a weekend trip to Aqaba, a resort on the coast of the Red Sea. And about 5 minutes into the trip, I managed to step on a sea urchin. I ended up with about 40 or 50 spines in each foot, and I was rushed to the emergency room, and I effectively ruined everybody's good time. While I was at the Jordanian ER, I had a doctor who spoke not very much English, and my 1 year of language training up to that point did not prepare me for talking to doctors about sea urchins and spines in my feet. So after a belabored hour of sitting in the ER trying to explain what had happened and what I would need to do for treatment, I left with 2 prescriptions and no idea what they were for. When I got back to the hotel, I did research online to find information about the prescriptions that I needed, but I couldn't find the information on the internet. And ultimately what I ended up doing was delaying therapy for about 5 or 6 hours until my contacts in the US were awake and they could provide me with help. In the moment where the internet was my most reliable or helpful source of information, I could not find what I needed. And this is kind of a big deal because when we think about this from a user perspective, finding usable information matters. According to the CDC, almost half of Americans are on 1 or more prescription medications, and 25% or a quarter of Americans are on at least 3 or more prescription drugs. And this matters from a manufacturer's perspective because as the number of prescriptions that a patient is on goes up, so does the risk of effective therapy, because things like dosing amount, frequency, drug interaction, and administration routes can vary widely when we're talking about different prescription drugs. And the likelihood of taking medications increases as the population continues to age. This is an important consideration because websites need to be optimized for worst case users, which could include an aging population on multiple medication. Just one more point to bring this all home. According to a Reuters article that was published all the way back in 2015, it found that 76% of patients that they talked to thought that pharmaceutical companies had a responsibility to provide information and services in managing their health. When we look at this in sort of a deeper context and how HCPs and patients look at the site, according to an article published by Medical Marketing and Media in 2017, only 34% of physicians found pharmaceutical HCP sites to be trustworthy sources of information. And this is because the information that's being provided to make better treatment decisions for patients is just too difficult, and it takes HCPs a long time to find what they're looking for on pharmaceutical websites. Conversely, when we look at that from the patient perspective, another article published by Medical Marketing and Media in 2019 found that patients want pharmaceutical branded websites to be sort of their one-stop shop for treatments. For context, this article said that about 52% of the patients that they surveyed were going to pharmaceutical and medical device websites to research their treatment, and that nearly matched the 54% who said that they were talking to their doctors about treatment information. And this is an important fact because patients are relying on these websites to learn about treatment information almost as much as they are their doctors. And when we think about these numbers, it's likely that they have increased as internet usage and reliance on websites has gone up during the COVID-19 pandemic. So the message here is clear. Pharmaceutical websites need to be able to provide users with information that they're looking for. And that sets us up to ask the question of how are pharmaceutical websites set up to fulfill this expectation? And we need to start by realizing that there are three main types of users for pharma websites. The first is going to be patients and caregivers, or the end users. We'll focus mostly on them today. But there's also other groups such as the healthcare providers or the payers slash insurance companies. And in order to be effective, pharmaceutical manufacturers need to be able to communicate the pieces of information that to the appropriate audiences when they're seeking it out. The calls to action on the pharmaceutical website need to be able to assist the end user in accomplishing their goal. And what those goals sort of look like is doctors and healthcare providers are going to utilize the sites differently than the other two groups. Typically, when they're going to the sites, they're going to find information that is scientific and clinical based and is going to help them make decisions in treating their patients. Whereas when we talk about the payers or the insurance company, admittedly, this is a smaller group, but what they're looking for is information that's going to help them out with the insurance payout information. And finally, the group that we're going to talk more about here today in today's webinar is the patient and caregiver interactions with the site. And most pharmaceutical websites are set up to get out main points about prescribing information, or PI, maybe allow users to sign up for discount cards, and perhaps provide some sort of support reform channels. This group is the one that we're choosing to focus on in the webinar today because this is most likely the worst case scenario for users because they have infrequent interactions with a lot of pharmaceutical information. And it's important that the sites are set up well because the consequences of not having a website where information is easy to find is that users may find the pharmaceutical company to be trustful and to seek more digestible content from other sources. What this can mean is that the user may end up seeking out other user-generated content from video platforms like YouTube or sites like WebMD, and the effectiveness of the communication that's being provided on these sites can vary by source. And ultimately what's happening here is risk is being introduced because the manufacturer no longer controls the narrative when the user goes to these third-party sites. So what we wanted to do was determine how effective pharmaceutical websites were at communicating information that could help the end user in their treatment and build trust amongst the patient population. So what we did is we started by looking at the top 10 selling drugs in the United States in 2019 and doing an expert evaluation of their websites. One important caveat that I do want to call out here is that sales numbers do not give us an accurate picture of how many patients are on each of these treatments. So we are doing a little bit of extrapolating here and saying that a high number of sales correlates to a high number of end users who could be potentially accessing the medications website to understand about their therapy. And what we learned from our high-level analysis is that there's 7 pharmaceutical manufacturers that are represented here that have websites that treat a myriad of conditions and administration routes. And none of this is really surprising. There's sort of a lack of consistency across these top 10 selling drugs. I have to consider that there's things like the different manufacturers that we talked about, different administration route, different conditions being treated, and so on. And that does necessitate some variety from site to site. What the key takeaway here is, though, that the user experience of each of these websites can vary so much from site to site that essentially every new visitor to a pharmaceutical website has to be treated like a naive user. And that's because information on these sites is laid out differently. And it should be laid out in a way that is simple to navigate for someone who is unfamiliar with the structure of the page. So if identifying that new page users are naive to the page's architecture is really just the tip of the iceberg of what we're talking about here today, because there's other things that need to be considered, such as patients having access to the website potentially without HCP guidance or assistance. So if the information is too complex to understand, it can be a frightening experience to try and learn about your condition and treatment options without proper context. And these issues can become compounded even further when you start to think about accessibility issues that can arise during therapy. First, a big one is tech savviness. When we're talking about websites, we're talking about users needing to be able to understand navigation prompts, iconography, and functionality of just being able to get around on the site. Another big one is talking about cognitive impairments and physical disabilities. There are some conditions and or therapies that can cause reduced cognitive function or have associated physical disabilities. Specifically, when thinking about websites, visual impairment is a big one and can cause a huge barrier that would affect effective usage of the website. And finally, want to just touch a little bit here on language barriers and low literacy, because pharmaceutical websites are not easily found in multilingual formats. And the information that's being communicated on the page is not always written in a way that's clearly communicated to individuals who don't have a medical background, and that's a problem. So if talking about accessibility is not enough of a concern here, COVID adds extra layers that just did not exist to the same degree prior to 2020. Not only has the virus potentially increased financial hardship and perhaps affected the patient's ability to continue treatment, but it's also limited access that the patient may be able to have in a face-to-face clinical setting with their healthcare provider. And one day we are going to be in a post-COVID pandemic world. The pandemic is going to have these long-reaching effects, and one of the big ones for pharmaceuticals is that we'll be in a world where web conferencing telehealth options are still available to patients. And this means that websites for disease education and therapy treatments are going to need to be optimized for patients who could be spending less time in the doctor's office and having an opportunity to speak face-to-face with their physician. We also need to talk about the regulatory aspect that goes into the website design. And really what the FDA has to say here is really kind of vague. And what we understand about what the FDA says on the matter is that their rules serve more as guardrails than guidelines for getting a site out for consumer consumption. So pharmaceuticals need to do things like make sure that they don't exceed claims of the PI for the medication, and all the claims that they make are being backed up by scientific data. And another big one is including the important safety information for the ISI on the page. But beyond that, determining everything else is really coming down to the medical and regulatory groups within the pharmaceutical organizations. And often what's happening is design is being outsourced. So what happens is that the pharmaceutical companies are left with this task internally to develop guidelines within those guardrails from the FDA. And it's important that part of this development includes consideration from the perspective of the user and determining that things work the way that users expect it to work. And that can really only be accomplished through usability research. So while we're talking about usability and user expectations, it's important to keep in mind that there are multiple digital platforms that patients can access to provide them the information. And those come with different usability concerns. When we're talking about desktops, we're talking about big screens and large formats where a user has the ability to navigate multiple tabs and go through different pages easily. And then thinking about how that shifts over to the smartphone and how the content often looks like a smushed version of the desktop where content can wrap, information can be truncated, and navigation is not as easy to accomplish. And one thought that I'm going to give you all today is that it's important that we realize as an industry that voice assistant technologies are an emerging market. Nearly 90 million US adults have smart speakers. And that means that the adoption and use of voice assistant technology now exceeds 1/3 of the consumers in the United States. And given that voice technologies are becoming more prevalent in other industries, implementing voice technology as a part of the therapeutic process is on the horizon for pharmaceuticals. And while that is an interesting topic to explore, we're going to focus primarily on the desktop and smartphone interfaces for the rest of the webinar, as they're what's most prevalent across the industry and accessible today. So I want to put all of this background into some context for you from the user's perspective. And I'd like you to imagine with me that you've been feeling unwell lately. You went to the doctor to have what you feel should be a routine checkup. During your visit, it's uncovered that you have a chronic condition that will need regular treatment with a brand name medication. While at the doctor's office, you ask all the questions that you can in the moment as you try to process how your new diagnosis and your therapy is going to potentially change your routines, your quality of life, and your outlook on the days ahead. In the hours and days that follow after you leave the doctor's office, it occurs to you that there are more questions that you have about your condition and your treatment options that you should have asked in the moment, but for whatever reason, you just didn't. But you have the information of the medication that the doctor is prescribing to you, and you want to learn more about how your condition and your therapy is going to affect you. So what you do is you go to that prescription medications website, intent on learning more, and you're greeted by a landing page that is overwhelming and difficult to navigate. And this is where the principles of usability design and validating that design through research can really come in and help make the experience better. And to highlight how this is an industry issue, we're going to take this next portion to identify some common design problems of existing websites that are live on the market. To do this, we did an expert review of those top 10 selling drugs that we talked about in the US. And despite the fact that there were different experiences across each of these sites, there were some common design themes that we were able to identify across these 10 sites. And we wireframed out these common design issues. I'd like to encourage you, if you'd like to see how these issues may apply to your drug portfolio, please feel free to open one of your product sites in another tab as we go through this next section. And just imagine with us how the multiple user groups that we talked about would be able to effectively use the site and find the information. And Kat's going to take us through the wireframe designs next.
So, hi, as Trevor mentioned, we performed an expert evaluation on the top pharmaceutical websites in the United States to uncover consistent usability issues that could impact conversion. In this review, we looked at factors that prohibit ease of use and accessibility based on UX best practice and heuristic principles. Issues were analyzed based on severity. From this evaluation, we created a sample website that incorporated the most prevalent issues. The primary issue across all sites was a lack of clear visual hierarchy, which made the content difficult to scan. There were many layers of navigation, expansive multi-line text, and inconsistent interaction design. In the following slides, I will go top to bottom through the example design to greater understand and uncover design issues. These findings will in turn lead to design recommendations for resolutions that are easy to implement and will make a strong impact on your usability. With COVID being at the forefront of everyone's mind across the globe, it's not surprising that it also is mentioned on many websites along with information regarding financial assistance. However, it is frequently placed in a location that lacks visual prominence, making it easily overlooked. It is placed in an area that is traditionally reserved for quaternary priority items and offered the same visual weight as other navigational elements. There are many layers of navigation, and it is unclear what their priority or importance is due to placement and visual design. As you can see here, there are 3 rows of navigation on the top of the screen. The most important row of those 3, or the primary navigation, is below the secondary navigation and call to action links. Determining which calls to action are the most important to your business will be dictated by goals for conversion. Why do you want customers to come to your site? And user goals, which will be determined by research. Less is more when it comes to design, and definitely when it comes to types and numbers of navigational elements. Important information for users is also hidden in unlikely places and displayed as multi-line text, which is easily negated. The term hero space refers to a large, prominently placed graphical area on a web page. It is an opportunity to expose users to the website or product objectives, and it's typically the full width of the page. This space is better utilized with a single interaction, but if multiple interactions are needed, they should each have the same interaction design to avoid user confusion. Additionally, using a smaller amount of vertical space will allow more important information to be displayed above the page fold. The widget we are looking at on this slide is the ISI, or Important Safety Information. It floats over the page right at the fold, hovering above extensive multi-line text, creating an overall disorienting experience. Once expanded, it is dense, lacks section headers and bullets, and the font is very small. Overall, it is not able to be scanned and does not meet accessibility standards due to the layout and design. In displaying ISI content, consider breaking the content into digestible hunks that have section titles and pertinent content bulleted. Additionally, allowing this information to open in a separate window or pop-up will make it much easier to access on demand by divorcing it from other page content. And then, as you can see here, the other page content is displayed in that same manner, lacking headers, bullets, and in a very small font. In scanning the full page, it is easy to see why users struggle to find the information that they seek. Overall, the page is busy and overwhelming. The text is dense, making it difficult to scan. There are too many calls to action, each with varying interaction types, and far too many layers of navigation that do not take user needs driven by research into consideration. I think that you'll find that the issues we uncovered on mobile sites are very similar to those found on desktop, but now on a much smaller screen, making them even more challenging to navigate. The issue that we're looking at on this page was unique to mobile and not found on desktop sites. It is best practice to place the name and logo of a website in the page header. However, as you can see here, it is placed towards the bottom of the screen, making it easily overlooked and creating potential confusion. This issue is particularly important when users are looking across multiple websites in separate browser windows when researching medication or condition. The secondary navigation is given priority over the primary navigation, which is located in a hamburger menu towards the bottom of the page. This approach to site navigation is not best practice, and it also does not take user needs into consideration nor facilitate speed and ease of use. Inconsistent and excessive page interactions increase cognitive load for users. Simplifying to a single interaction style on the landing page, such as a link that takes the user to another screen, would greatly increase ease of use and maintain best practice usability standards. Throughout the mobile site, vast multi-line text blocks appear in unexpected locations. These expanses of text are easy for users to negate because they are hard to scan, but also they are given visual priority over primary page content and navigation. Again, as with desktop, breaking the content into more digestible hunks with titles, bullets, and perhaps displaying on their own pages will make the user experience of finding information relevant to their needs so much more positive. When you look at the page and its overall structure, it is extraordinarily difficult to locate the information that you seek. Some simple, easy to implement changes can make a world of difference here. Use a single navigation to find all important site content. Instead of exposing all informational text on the landing page, a link to a pop-up or separate page would increase ease of use. Move identifying site information such as the logo and the drug name to the header to avoid confusion, and reduce the number of page interactions and use a consistent interaction style to avoid forcing users to think about how to interact with the site. I've covered what the issues are, and in the next slides, I'm going to discuss how we can fix them from the ground up. To improve your website, you must first understand who your users are and why they're coming to your site. It should all begin with research to explore user needs to best design a website that will drive conversion while maintaining best practices in design. We start with discovery, which includes various types of research. Move on to ideation or collaborative pre-design work, then to an iterative design process that allows each stage of the site design to be tested and perfected. It is advisable to include medical regulatory staff early in the process to avoid rework later. They should be included in ideation workshops as well as reviews of research stimuli prior to testing with participants. We will examine each step in this process moving forward. There are many ways to uncover information about your site users, their conditions, and how they consume information. Which methods are right for you will be determined by your unique business model and needs. But some examples are ethnographic studies. Here we work to understand people in their homes, how they live with their condition, and what has brought them to visit your website. Diary studies allow us to look into a user's day-to-day activities and concerns as they relate to their condition in particular. We have focus groups in which we would speak with a handful of users with the same or similar condition to have a meaningful conversation about their site use and needs. And then finally, IDIs, or in-depth interviews. These allow us to speak to a single user one-on-one to learn about their experience with their condition and their site use. Ideation activities allow for a collaborative environment in which stakeholders, users, medical regulatory staff, and UX researchers and designers work together to inform designs that meet everyone's needs. Some activity examples would be co-creation workshops. This is where consumers, users, and stakeholders work with regulatory staff and collaborate with researchers and designers to develop ideas and concepts for the client. User stories. are a written explanation of features from the perspective of the end user or customer. Concept creation is a process that takes a list of parameters defined by users and customers based on specific needs that help pinpoint possible solutions and ideas to answer those needs. Storyboarding, which is an illustrative sequence that represents the steps in a process that a user would take when navigating your website. And finally, jobs to be done, which would be a list of mechanisms that cause a user to adopt various innovations. An iterative or cyclical design process produces a final product with optimal usability. It consists of sketching, testing, designing, and testing some more. All design stimuli should be approved by medical regulatory staff prior to testing with research participants to avoid excessive rework later. Sketches can include things like task or use case maps, navigational design, mood boards, style tiles, low fidelity wireframes, and even hand sketching. Output would then be tested with users before moving on to a higher fidelity deliverable. Design consists of the expert development of software or site information architecture, UI design, and potentially even clickable prototypes. Output would ideally be retested with the same or different user group. And finally, testing can be performed either in lab or remotely and includes field testing, unmoderated or moderated testing, rapid iteration testing, and or validation testing. Now we will look at some proposed designs based on the expert evaluations that we performed on those top 10 sites we discussed. A lack of user consideration and formal information architecture structure can cause user confusion and ultimately task abandonment on a website. Here we will consider a user-driven information architecture as discovered during our expert evaluation of those top 10 sites. We will show you two possible site structures, one based on condition and the other based on medical information that a user could potentially be seeking. The following wireframe mockups are for a desktop website in a condition-based information architecture in which users visit the website to learn about how the selected drug will work for their very specific condition. Users will still have easy access to information about the product based on their needs and will accommodate for user type possibilities without causing cognitive overload for users with too much information or content up front. As part of the redesign, we must also consider accessibility. Here are some easy ways to improve accessibility without being an expert. Confirm all your pages on your website have a title. Include alternatives to text, such as images, illustrations, graphs, and icons. Include text headings and form field labels, the ability to resize text, and confirm that the background to contrast ratio for text is high enough to meet a minimum of AA standards, but really, preferably AAA. You can use an online contrast checker to confirm this, and I've included a link in this PowerPoint when you're provided it after the call. Make sure that page content can be read by a screen reader. Include keyboard focus states for form fields, links, and controls. Include keyboard shortcuts for controls and voice commands, and then omit any flashing or moving content. Links to key site content are featured in the header with both icons and labels to make them easy to locate and accessible for most users. Search was not found on most of our evaluated sites, making it even more challenging for users to find the information they required. We recommend adding search to all site headers to allow users to find needed information quickly via keyword search, thereby reducing the risk of task abandonment. An easy to implement and robust option is to work with Google to integrate site search. As you can see, we've condensed the site navigation to a single horizontal row of links based on user need as discovered during our research. Quick links can bubble up key content on the site. We would also determine what those would be based on user research. The screen is now simplified, scannable, and takes accessibility into consideration. In this next information architecture, the user will visit a pharmaceutical website to locate product information such as usage, interactions, financial information. The following wireframes are for a mobile website in a medical information-based information architecture. Responsive design will allow your mobile site design and layout to not greatly differ from the desktop, except that presentation of content is in a much smaller medium. As you can see, we still have tiles for the primary user needs based on research and quick links to bubble up viable information. Auxiliary navigation has been reduced to just the search. This is due to the spatial constraints of a mobile platform. And then all primary and auxiliary navigational items, except for the search, have been condensed into a hamburger menu. The hero space has been greatly reduced, so this allows pertinent information to move up onto the page. And the user need or condition-related buttons are all displayed above the fold. And here are quick links again, bubbling up that key content. When looking at the entire mobile screen, the page is now easy to scan. Pertinent calls to action are easy to locate, and the user is not overloaded with a text-heavy page. Trevor, you can take it from here.
Thanks, Kat. So it's necessary to realize then that pharmaceutical websites should be optimized through user testing, because identifying design problems is really only half the equation. If you create slick designs that don't fulfill what the user seeks when they arrive on a website, that can still lead to all the problems that we talked about earlier, such as issues with hierarchy of information, confusing navigation, and chunky, unreadable text. To avoid these problems, the effectiveness of design needs to undergo rigorous user testing to ensure that the design solutions are really solutions. It's important to roll out various methodologies throughout the design and research process, such as the persona research, journey mapping, card sorting, and usability testing, to ensure that the site that goes live is effective and it meets the user for the task at hand. In conclusion, then, pharmaceutical websites need to be designed as easy-to-use sources of information because patients expect pharmaceutical companies to provide information and services in managing their health. In order to provide information that is effective for use and consumption, websites need to be laid out in such a way that naive users can easily navigate the platform and find the information that they're looking for. If information being presented to users, then it needs to be presented in a manner that is consumable. And if you don't have good usability on a website, then the user may seek out what they are searching for from a third-party source. One has to start by understanding user needs of page visitors to ensure that proper usability and design and research principles are incorporated into a website, and that can minimize risk by reducing user frustration and creating a sense of trust through transparency when information is able to be easily found on the site. Building better pharmaceutical websites through usability, design, and research just makes sense for both the end user and the manufacturer. I'd like to thank you all for joining the presentation. Kat, I think we had some questions come through.
Oh, sure. Let's take a look. So here's the first one. How do we condense information while still meeting regulatory guidelines?
Right. So the important thing here is to make sure that like the links and icons are going to be prominently placed throughout the website to guide the user to the proper content. It's important that while we go through the process of updating and building a better pharmaceutical website, that we're not removing content, but that we're formatting it in such a way that it is easy to use and easy to find for the user.
Great. Oh, here's another. How do we balance quantity of content with simplification to create a more usable website that is also compliant?
So That can be done by doing things like including links to all sorts of needed comments, all sorts of needed content that can open in a separate window, perhaps, and be presented in a way where information could be more digestible. Also, content needs to be broken up into a way where what's being presented is digestible. It's formatted in a way that includes clear titles, things like labels and bullets that are really going to help your user navigate to different parts of the page.
Okay, and looks like there's one more. How does implementing the changes you guys talked about here today lower risk for patient therapy?
Right. So the important thing is that the information on the websites needs to be usable, like we talked about. So the problem here is that if the pharmaceutical companies are not providing information about the therapies that's easy to find and use, then the big risk comes when the user may seek out information from secondary or even tertiary sources. And the problem with that is that you may get lost in translation, right? So important information may be construed the wrong way if it's not the manufacturer that's presenting it. The manufacturer's done all the research and development on the product. And to get to the point where the end user is using it and then finding out how to use it from a different source just introduces risk of potentially taking it the wrong way or misunderstanding the information that's being presented.
So I think that was all of the questions that I saw in the chat. I think we could pass it back to Megan.
Thanks so much to both of you for today's interesting presentation. And thank you everyone for joining us today. If we didn't get to your question, then we will do so by email. You will also receive an email with a direct link to today's recorded presentation. Additionally, you can reference the handout section in your event console for more information about the research we shared today. And of course, we welcome the opportunity to speak with you, so please feel free to reach out to us. That now concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful day.